Okay, in this video I want to get into all kinds of strange things that are going on with the human body from a design perspective. First, this is from Discover magazine, Science That Matters. Humans have a very needy diet when it comes to essential micronutrients, more so than other animals. This likely stems from an evolutionary past in which our ancestors enjoyed a richly varied diet and obtaining vitamins and minerals was rarely a challenge. Now, I should say, first of all, you will notice that when you go down this path researching these types of things, all of the mainstream publications are explaining what is going on through the lens of evolution, because that is the widely accepted view of how we became what we are. So just keep that in mind as we're going over all of this. There are potentially other explanations for why things are the way that they are, but none of these articles are going to be considering those possibilities. As I've written previously, we need vitamin C in our diet, whereas most animals don't, because a distant ancestor already had abundant vitamin C in her diet when she suffered the mutation that killed one of the genes for vitamin C synthesis. The story of vitamin D deficiency is another example of wonky evolution in our lineage that you can read about here. Our bodies have their share of traits that don't necessarily align with the principles of good design. What a sentence that is! Let me repeat that. Our bodies have their share of traits that don't necessarily align with the principles of good design. Again, from the mainstream perspective, they view it as some coincidence of evolution that explains why these things transpired. But if we're just using common sense and looking at it objectively, we could say, well, if we have been created by an intelligence that most would label God or the Creator, surely that level of intelligence would have the principles of good design in mind when it was developing its creation or imagining its creation in its mind, producing a fractal of it in the form that we take here in this place that they call Earth. And in that scenario, we probably need to be looking at other possible explanations for why these bad designs are present in the human body. I suppose you could consider the idea that the intelligence that created us in the first place allowed for free will, and then as a part of evolution within free will, maybe some of these things just organically developed, and they could be explained in the way that the mainstream explains them. That's possible. Alternatively, if an intelligence broke away from that which created us and took control of this place that they called Earth and started manipulating our genetics, that could also explain why some of the things are the way that they are, especially as it relates to B12, as I've gotten into before, and the food chain. The fact that we are required to obtain B12 from animal products, or animal flesh in general, requires us to hunt and kill animals. It forces the food chain where life consumes life, at least our role in that. You could get into ideas about genetically manipulating other creatures to create that part of the food chain in other areas of nature. And then obviously from that initial manipulation, you would have the adaptation that takes place when we are left to our own devices in nature. And adaptation is much different than evolution as it is generally sold to us. So anyway, our bodies have their share of traits that don't necessarily align with the principles of good design. Vitamin B12, though, may be one of the worst offenders. Vitamin B12 actually refers to a family of closely related molecules called the cobalmins, so named because they incorporate an ion of the element cobalt in their structure. In fact, this is the only known biological purpose of the element cobalt, which is why it is sometimes called an ultratrace element in the human diet. But it's crucial for our survival. Every single cell in our body requires B12 to function properly. We need it to make fatty acids, amino acids, and to replicate and repair DNA. So B12 has this amazingly important function in our body, and yet for some reason we don't produce it ourselves. And this is going back to the idea of this being a bad design. Why would you design the body to need something that it doesn't produce on its own? In other words, if you were designing a body to thrive in an environment, why would you force that body to acquire something so important from a scarce resource, something that requires a lot of effort and energy to obtain, and if it's not readily available, causes the body to die or not function properly? The nervous system is especially dependent on B12 because many fatty acids are used to make myelin, the sheaths that wrap our neurons and nerve bundles. Deficiencies of B12 cause an affliction called macrocytic anemia. This condition resembles some of the side effects of cancer chemotherapy and has the same root cause. Cells that are rapidly dividing are especially sensitive to impaired DNA synthesis. The stem cells in our bone marrow that generate blood cells are among the most actively dividing cells in the body. So when DNA synthesis is impaired, either by chemotherapeutic drugs or a vitamin B12 deficiency, we experience a drop in blood cell counts, zapping our energy and weakening our immune system. This condition can be life-threatening if it continues for too long, as I found out through my own experience. It's not pleasant, let me tell you. B12 is the only nutrient in the human diet that simply must come from animal products. Again, we have to ask the question, why would it be that this really important nutrient must come from animal products and we don't produce it on our own? Well, there are all kinds of explanations, potentially. This article, as we go on, is going to get into a potential evolutionarily accidental explanation to explain it. And then we have to consider the alternatives that might be at work here as it relates to our bodies being genetically manipulated to produce the food chain that enables the suffering that exists on this planet at a very subconscious level. The violence that we all experience in the world and see all around us is a direct function of the violence in nature, which is a direct function of the food chain that requires beings to fight, kill, and consume each other to survive. Do you see? Why would that be the most effective design? And it's interesting getting into a prior video where someone left a comment along these lines about how if you interpret the Genesis part of the Bible a certain way and look up the meaning of the words in a certain way, it hints at the idea that our bodies used to be vegetarian and we didn't used to have a food chain like this before the fall. And this article is going to get into that a little bit too, so keep that in mind. The best source of B12 is meat, including both red and white meat, fish, and seafood. Eggs and milk have some B12 as well. Plants and fungi, however, have no need for B12 and therefore do not contain any of it. Strict vegans have no choice but to supplement their diet with B12 somehow, often through fortified soy or almond milk. This begs the question, if animal products are the only source of B12, how do herbivores survive? The secret is in their guts. Vegetarian animals harbor bacteria in their intestines that make vitamin B12 for them. This is a symbiosis of sorts where the herbivores provide a steady supply of food and a nice warm home, and the bacteria excrete B12 that the herbivores then absorb. This arrangement may seem familiar because humans have a similar sort of relationship with bacteria that produce vitamin K for us. You've likely never heard of it because we don't have to worry about consuming this particular vitamin. Instead, several different bacterial species that live in our large intestine make and excrete vitamin K, and we absorb it from there. Because vitamin K is crucial for blood clotting, we would be in big trouble if not for this symbiosis in our gut. In fact, one of the side effects of a sustained course of strong antibiotics is impaired blood clotting, as the antibiotics wipe out our intestinal bacteria and we experience a temporary deficiency in vitamin K. It would seem helpful if we had the same setup with B12, and we actually do. In fact, many of the same bacteria that make vitamin K for us also produce B12. So what's the problem? Now this is where it gets really crazy. Intestinal switcheroo. It turns out to be a case of... Sorry, I couldn't even get through that sentence. It turns out to be a case of bad plumbing. Again, you got to think about what we're talking about here. We're talking about God creating us in its image. Why would it give us bad plumbing intentionally? We got to ask these kinds of questions here. The bacteria that are nice enough to make this nutrient for us live in our large intestine, but we are only capable of absorbing it in our small intestine. Again, why would this be the design? Because the small intestine comes before the large intestine in the flow of gastrointestinal traffic, we end up sending the B12 that our gut bacteria produce right to the toilet rather than absorbing it. What a waste. I mean, think about what we're actually doing there. That makes no sense. Why would we do that? We have the bacteria that all the herbivores are using to produce their own B12 internally, so they can only eat plants and be fine. And yet for us, we're producing that in a part of the intestines that goes directly out the door, as it were, before we ever have a chance to absorb it. This makes no sense. It's literally forcing us to hunt and kill animals, this setup. In case you were wondering, a study did find that human fecal matter is indeed high enough in cobalmins to serve as an adequate dietary source of vitamin B12. I wouldn't recommend turning to the toilet for your B12, though. Exactly how this glitch in our gastrointestinal functioning came about is largely a mystery. Of course, no one can explain it. And this is where they will try to explain it in an evolutionary sense. And for all I know, this could be correct. But they never consider the alternative views because this is established as what the truth is. So they must explain it within this context. Anyway, most primates are herbivorous, and indeed all of our fellow apes subsist on a fully or mostly plant-based diet. It is therefore likely that we descend from a long line of vegetarians, and this is what I was referring to earlier about the passage of Genesis referring to what people were subsisting off of in the beginning. And that gets into the prior video when I was going over the cognitive dissonance that we are suffering from when we become aware of certain things and we feel intuitively in our heart that we're not supposed to be doing this, but then at the same time we have to do it in order to survive. Maybe there's some truth to that cognitive dissonance from a genetic memory perspective where we are tapping into that memory of the first people made in the image of God itself that were in this place they call Earth, subsisting only on vegetables and possibly even less. The energetic structure of the environment might have been totally different before the events outlined in the Bible transpired. The biting of the apple, the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, etc. During the millions of years our ancestors thrived on plants, they surely were able to capture the vitamin B12 that was being made by bacteria in their guts, or else they wouldn't have survived. And obviously this perspective of evolution is at odds with a lot of other perspectives relating to the time that has allegedly elapsed in this place. Even the Freemasons agree with the more fundamental interpretations of the Bible that say this realm is only 6,000 years old. And the flip side of that is this evolutionary Big Bang perspective that states it's millions and millions and millions of years old. Longer than we can possibly imagine with our tiny human brains. As usual, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle there, even to the point where the traditional mainstream interpretation of how things were created could be accurate in the same way that you can find the Fibonacci sequence in various places in nature. You can read the scaffolding of the creation, find the math, And in that way, some of what the mainstream is saying might be true as it relates to the creation of it, but then they just take out the intelligence that is behind all that. They take out the idea that it is an idea in the mind of God that created it. They're trying to describe that action in the mind of God. The point being that there could be an aspect of things talked about in articles like this that are actually true. It's just not in the correct context, and that's what we have to do, is try to figure out what the actual context is that we should be placing these facts in. Once our forebears began scavenging meat and bone marrow, they found themselves with a steady supply of dietary vitamin B12, which then grew in abundance when we began to hunt. It must have been during this meat-eating stage in our evolution that we began to absorb B12 in the small intestine instead of the large one. We are now stuck with this odd arrangement, making humans, at least in this very narrow sense, obligate carnivores. And speaking of the biblical interpretation, there are people that look into that who say, well, after the fall and the flood, we were forced to start eating meat in this way in order to survive. It wasn't designed to be like that, but this was forced after all of that happened, and that would kind of line up with what this evolutionary perspective is saying must have happened in order to explain it in those terms. And then at the same time, if we look at the ability to create bioweapons in the modern world in the form of viruses, we could imagine a third possibility where certain viruses or nanotechnology, as it were, biologically speaking, was introduced into the environment that forced changes like this to create a certain environment on the planet. But this article did mention vitamin C too, and then they do the same thing with that. This article, GLUT1 explains the evolutionary advantage of the loss of endogenous vitamin C synthesis, the electron transfer hypothesis, and they go into a similar idea, trying to explain why it would be beneficial to not produce our own internal vitamin C. Why would we evolve to not do that when we need it? Why would you force us to get it from our diet? And evolutionarily speaking, they always go back to the idea of, well, there was some ancestor that was eating a ton of things that had vitamin C, and then the body just decided eventually, well, we're not going to produce that internally anymore. We don't need to. As it says here, during evolution, some species, including humans, monkeys, and fruit bats, lost the ability for ascorbic acid biosynthesis due to inactivation of the enzyme L-gulonolactone oxidase, and subsequently became dependent on dietary vitamin C. So it's a similar thing that happened with vitamin B12. We don't produce our own vitamin C, and they go through all kinds of potential explanations for why this would have been the case, evolutionary speaking, because they have to come up with some reason. Why would we do this? It doesn't make any sense. It's the same with the vitamin B12 and the bad plumbing. Why would we evolve to have bad plumbing? Do you see? That makes no sense. It's the whole idea of evolution is natural selection. In other words, if it is true, or if there is some truth to it, over time, we are selecting the best possible traits for survival. And in that context, they're telling us that it was the best way to survive to have bad plumbing and not produce our own B12 that is able to be absorbed by the body. No, we just excrete it out without ever touching it. That doesn't make any sense. And then at the same time, we likewise don't produce our own vitamin C. Why? This doesn't make any sense when we need it. And you could get into a similar idea about vitamin C, like you can with B12. Well, vitamin C plays this essential role in immune health. And if we have to get it from our diet and we're not producing it in our body, well, that would predispose us to be less able to fight off certain pathogens. Again, why would that be evolutionarily beneficial from a natural selection point of view? Surely, if there was truth to this, our ancestors who survived would have been the most resilient to viruses, bacteria, and other pathogens. Okay, now next, let's get into the thymus gland. Speaking of immunity, the thymus gland is the body organ that took scientists the longest time to understand. It's only active from when you're born until you become a teenager. Still, it plays a huge role in training your body to fight infections and even cancer for the rest of your life. It's also vital to the body's chemical messaging or endocrine system. The thymus gland is usually located behind the breastbone, in front of the heart, and between the lungs. In some people, though, this organ is found in the neck or upper chest. And this is the thymus, usually located right here. You can see it has 2 lobes. While that may seem odd, it's part of the organ's mystery that has baffled scientists for centuries. Researchers only began to understand some of the gland's function about 50 years ago. They still aren't sure where it got its name. Some experts say the ancient Greeks who discovered the organ named it thymus because its shape looks like the leaves of thyme, a cooking herb. Others say the name came from the Greek word for the soul because the organ is near the heart. Either way, the thymus gland is considered an immune system organ. The famous Greek philosopher-surgeon Galen was the first to notice that the thymus gland changes with age. Galen wrote that it's large in newborn animals and becomes smaller when they're adults. Your thymus gland reaches its maximum size when you're a teenager. Then it starts to shrink slowly. By the time you turn 75 years old, your thymus gland turns to fat. The term scientists use to describe this organ shrinking process is called involution. From the time you're conceived until you reach puberty, your thymus gland is very active. It serves both the immune and endocrine systems. That's the system that makes hormones the body's chemical messengers. To understand the thymus's immune system role, you need to know the difference between 2 kinds of white blood cells. They are the T lymphocytes, T cells, and B lymphocytes, B cells. These cells are like the immune system's special ops forces. So are really important cells that are involved in our immune system are produced in the thymus, especially when we're younger. T cells are also known as thymus-derived lymphocytes. They help fight off the body's foreign invaders such as bacteria, viruses, and toxins. They can also identify and attack cancer cells. B lymphocytes or B cells have a different role. They produce proteins called antibodies and use them to destroy specific invaders. When the immune system's first responders and defenders need extra help, they call in the T cells. They're made in the bone marrow, the spongy tissue within your bones. When T cells are young or immature, they travel through the bloodstream and into the thymus gland. The thymus has 2 lobes. One houses a sort of boot camp training ground for T cells. That's where they mature and turn into specialty disease-fighting cells with different jobs. So how incredible is this that our Green Beret or Navy SEAL T cells are being trained in the thymus, and the thymus, for inexplicable reasons, eventually turns into fatty tissue that doesn't do what it used to do when you were young. How do we explain this from an evolutionary viewpoint? How would that be beneficial for this thymus gland to eventually go away, and with it, the ability to continually train these cells that are so good at preventing things like cancer? Doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? Once the T cells recognize specific pathogens, they travel to another part of the thymus gland called the medulla. Here they get a different kind of training, negative selection. They're introduced to the body's antigens so they don't attack and harm them. This prevents autoimmune disorders. And when you hear that, it should really be ringing some alarm bells in your mind, given the huge prevalence of autoimmune conditions in the population right now. And many people who are older get these diseases as their thymus is no longer functioning in the way that it was when they got to puberty, and then it started to turn into just a fatty piece of tissue that's not active anymore. So I don't know, it's just interesting to think, would it be possible, genetically speaking, I don't know, but would it be possible to engineer something that could be like a time-release pathogen that would eventually make the thymus gland dormant? Would it be possible to introduce something like that into the body? I don't know. But interesting to consider. Because theoretically, if this gland remained active and didn't eventually go dormant, people would have a much better ability well into old age to remain healthier, to fight off pathogens, fight off cancers and autoimmune disorders, and just be relatively more healthy for much longer. And this could even extend lifespans, potentially. Again, you have to ask the question, why would it be evolutionarily beneficial for our ancestors to develop this trait where this thing eventually goes dormant? And I'm sure they have an explanation for this, like they do, or I should say a potential explanation for this, like they do for vitamin C and vitamin B12. But again, we got to consider this in a different context as we're connecting all of these dots together. And if you consider a more biblical perspective, well, you could say that this is God itself that's kind of put this limitation on all of us here due to the rampant sinning that is going on in the world and just the way that everything is so diseased here. That the prior conditions where the original design was living for hundreds and hundreds of years was no longer viable, let's say. Because in this context, a fallen angel that was God's creation came into this realm that they call Earth and took it over, like a cancer cell begins to take over the body. And it began to build itself a kingdom in the same way that cancer cells would begin to take over more and more cells in the body and grow at the expense of the health of the body itself. Cancer cells are immortal in that way. So in that context, we could consider these limitations that don't make any common sense to us when we look at it a certain way, being very logical and beneficial from a scale higher than our human mind, in this case, the highest scale, that of the mind of God, where it looks at the situation and it says, oh no, I'm going to put these limitations on your aging and your body because I'm not going to subject you to any more torture than you are already subjected to being incarnated here. And as a result of those organic limitations on the body, that's sort of why we see the transhumanist movement growing in popularity, because that is this intelligence in control of its kingdom on Earth currently attempting to become immortal through technology, because it can't do it in these bodies. So is that what it is? How should I know? I have no idea. All of this is just speculation and thought experiments in different contexts, seeing what makes the most sense. But keeping in mind, to the point that I just went over, that what makes the most sense to our tiny human minds might not matter because we can't see the bigger picture, as it were. So from there we move on to Telomeres, a guide for the scientifically challenged. Researchers have known for about 30 years that the secret to slowing down the body's aging process exists inside each one of us. These built-in fountains of youth are called telomeres, tiny DNA strand end caps that can be compared to those little plastic doodads on the ends of our shoelaces. Taking care of our telomeres will keep the cells in our body regenerating longer and help us feel young, regardless of our chronological age. Pretend your shoelaces were capable of regenerating, like Doctor Who, whenever they got dirty or frayed. Those plastic caps at the end would shed just a cell or two each time your laces needed repair, keeping your laces sparkly white and intact for the life of your shoes. When shopping for shoelaces, you'd pick the ones with the longest doodads on the end, right? And you'd take care of those doodads, maybe tucking them inside the tongue of your shoes so they wouldn't chip or get damaged. You might wash them with special organic detergent guaranteed to keep doodads moist and supple. The point is that longer, better cared for doodads would increase the life of your sneaker laces, making your sneakers more attractive and durable. In this analogy, you are the shoe. The doodads are your telomeres, keeping your DNA strands from fraying and protecting their ability to regenerate new cell growth. Your telomeres may have started out a bit longer or shorter than mine, but that is less important than what happens to them over time. The speed at which they deteriorate and can no longer protect your DNA's cell-dividing ability depends on how well you nourish them. How do I nourish my telomeres? Okay, we are no longer shoes. We are fabulous, grown-up women with telomeres on the ends of our repetitive DNA chromosome strands, doing their job nicely. Our telomeres may cover up to 15,000 base chromosome pairs that are ready to split off new versions of themselves whenever a cell is damaged or has outlived its function. The protective coating also keeps these pairs from getting stuck together. Here's the thing. Every time a chromosome split occurs, we lose a portion of our telomeres. Eventually, our telomeres are too short to protect the chromosome, which can no longer divide. This causes the cell to die in a process known as apoptosis. We want to know how to take good care of those little end caps so we can remain healthy and youthful as we age. This brings us back to science just a bit in the form of an enzyme called telomerase, or telomere terminal transferase. The function of telomerase is to add chromosome sequences to our DNA ends. This is mostly pre-programmed during our body's development, meaning there is a lot of telomerase activity found in stem cells and virtually none occurring in the cells of our grown body. Again, this is just like the thymus. It's like our body is programmed to eventually stop doing the very thing that causes us to die, or prevents us from dying, I should say. We have all of this telomerase activity in our stem cells and when our body is growing, and then eventually they go away. In the exact same way that the immune system and the T cells and B cells produced by the thymus eventually go away in the way that they are active when you are younger. And I believe they say that you produce all the T cells in that way that you'll ever need before it eventually becomes a fatty tissue that's no longer active. But still, we got to expand our mind here and think about alternative possibilities where the telomerase and the thymus are active well beyond when they eventually go dormant. And you can imagine how we would not age in that scenario like we age now. So the logical question is this by design? Is this something that God planned into our bodies? Surely it planned us to eventually no longer be living at some point. That was in the natural design. But it's a matter of, has there been some type of genetic manipulation that is prematurely aging us? In the sense that aging then is a disease that is not natural and should be taking much longer to occur than it actually does. Or maybe a better way to look at it would be quality over quantity. On the one hand, the intelligence on the highest scale, referred to as the mind of God, looks at the situation here and it's almost its own version of cancer treatment to say, okay, shut down the thymus, shut down the telomerase, let's make sure that this disease that I'm seeing doesn't spread too quickly, let's make sure that the generations aren't lasting too long like they did in the past when I originally created this thing. And then at the same time, the intelligence that is referred to as Satan, that is in control of this realm currently, is doing its own genetic manipulation with things like our ability to absorb B12 and vitamin C, and creating its own viruses that are a form of nanotechnology that are capable of shifting the genetic code to express these types of things, using evolution as an alibi for its actions in that case. I'm not saying that's what it is, but in that scenario, in that context, it would be an alibi. Because those particular genetic changes reinforces the misery that takes place, which then reinforces the suffering that everyone experiences. You have all of these people getting horrible diseases, struggling, dying prematurely. And obviously this has a financial burden that is then recycled into the system, and all of these industries spring up to leech off of that suffering because it's a part of the general suffering apparatus on this planet. So you could have that going on at the same time that the mind of God is sort of showing us some mercy by not forcing us to be here so long, to endure all of that. So I don't know, it could be both things taking place at the same time. And someone looking at it from the evolutionary perspective would say, oh, well, according to history, we only lived until we were 30 years old, if we were lucky, when this whole thing started. And again, that's looking at it from a history perspective of science only and not considering the religious texts that talk about living for much longer than that, before all of that happened. But yes, if you go with only the evolutionary view, people were not living very long, and then science and medicine advanced to the point where lifespans were extended, and this was in line with improvements in sanitation and plumbing and everything that goes along with not allowing disease to spread so easily like it did in the past, before we had all of these modern ways of disposing waste. But I stopped reading that sentence before I finished it. This is mostly pre-programmed during our body's development, meaning there is a lot of telomerase activity found in stem cells and virtually none occurring in the cells of our grown body, with two exceptions. Fully developed germ cells and tumor cells are full of telomerase activity, which is why they can replicate so quickly. Yeah, that makes sense. Tumor cells are out of control replication, so they have a lot of this telomerase activity that is, when functioning correctly, keeping your chromosomes intact and able to divide to create new cells. And that's interesting. There's this case of Henrietta Lacks. She was a tobacco farmer who developed cervical cancer, went to get that looked at, and they took a sample of her tumor. And later, as it says here, why are her cells so important? Henrietta cells were the first immortal human cells ever grown in culture. They were essential to developing the polio vaccine. They went up in the first space missions to see what would happen to cells in zero gravity. Many scientific landmarks since then have used her cells, including cloning, gene mapping, and in vitro fertilization. The point being, this might have been the first, at least acknowledged, real-life version of someone like in the X-Men, Wolverine, that character, who has this rapid cell regeneration to the point where he basically couldn't die because he would instantly regenerate and heal himself. Well, it's like this actual human being had that ability. She just didn't know it yet, and she died before the ability to understand these types of things, at least as we are allowed to understand them, was at that level. But by the time they were analyzing her cells, they had already figured out, oh, these are doing something that all of these other samples aren't doing. So that's an interesting story that you can get into along these lines. You know, how many cases of this type of thing have existed over the years that we don't even know about, right? And the point of getting into this in the context of everything that I've gone over so far is, well, hey, this could have been an example of somebody who genetically was predisposed to overcome the disease of aging, if it is a disease, to the point where we should be living much longer than we do. And then obviously you have to get into the idea of, well, if it is a disease, what's causing it? And that I have no idea about. There could be so many different things. I mean, just imagine all the things that we're subject to from the time we're born until the time we die. I mean, it could be any number of things that is causing this. And it could be to the point where it's just genetically programmed into us now, where there's nothing that you could even do to remove it, even if you knew what it was. But anyway, the last thing that I wanted to end on is just a couple other dots in this thought experiment that you would want to connect in here. And that is from a lecture by Schlein, The Alphabet versus the Goddess. And he says some incredible things in here that I would need to look into more deeply to really make sure that it's accurate. This isn't my specialty. I can't confirm it, if it's real or not. So I'll just play it and we'll consider it in the context of all this.
Now, standing up does some very interesting things. First of all, you know, the birds and the fish and the mammals and the reptiles, they all move through the world pretty much with their vertebral column horizontal to the earth. But when you stand up, we move with our vertebral column vertical to the earth. So what that means is that we have positioned directly above our anus a huge mass of intestines, so that every person here is at risk for being turned inside out if you go for a stroll after a particularly heavy lunch. This is a gravitational hazard that does not exist for any other animal. So if you look at a picture of the human pelvis, it's shaped like a gigantic bowl. And one of its architectural functions is to prevent your guts from falling out your rectum. Now, as a result, the bony hole in the center of the pelvis in humans is actually very small. Well, after about 2 million years of wandering around in the underbrush, we happened to notice that our hands were free. And we dimly surmised if only we had a big brain, we could imagine a weapon that our free hands could brandish, and then we would be really dangerous. And beginning 400,000 years ago, we got our wish. For reasons unknown, our brain underwent this extraordinary hyperinflation, and we added an entire pound of brain tissue. We went from a 2-pound brain to a 3-pound brain in a very short period of time. Now, on your right, you see a gorilla pelvis. She weighs 200 pounds. She delivers a 3-pound infant. On your left, you see a human female who weighs 100 pounds. She delivers a 7-pound infant. This is a problem. The human female began to deliver the largest brain baby in all of animaldom. Any woman who's birthed a baby knows that the mismatch between the size of the baby's head and the diameter of the birth canal is such a mismatch that it produces a lot of problems delivering birth. There was recently an article in the New York Times that 20% of the women in sub-Saharan Africa are dying in childbirth. So evolution, to solve this problem, and first to try to solve it by getting around by coming up with these clever sleights of hand that thread the baby's head to the eye of the mother's birth canal. And then a catastrophe occurred. Women started to die in childbirth. I want you to think about this for a minute. There's no other animals where women die in the females die in childbirth. I mean, humans have the highest female mortality rate delivering babies of any other species. I mean, fortunately, we live in a first world country where this is an extraordinarily rare event. But go out and look at any cemetery prior to the 20th century and look at the dates that women died, and a lot of them died in childbirth. It was a very common occurrence. So you would think, wouldn't you, that we should have gone extinct. I mean, how could we have a species where the healthy young mothers delivering their firstborns are dying along with their babies? So you would think that we would have evolved wider-hipped, ineffectually waddling women, or smaller brain babies, or go extinct, none of which occurred.
So for the sake of the thought experiment and connecting all of these dots together, let's assume that this is correct. First of all, the fact that our bodies walk upright, heel to toe, defies the physics of this place, whatever it is, to the point where we are one of the only creatures that moves around like this here due to how it is set up. On top of that, then, our brains became so big out of nowhere at some point that it was difficult for the mothers to actually push the head out of the vagina, to the point where a lot of these mothers, before more modern techniques were introduced, died during childbirth. Again, if you're viewing it from an evolutionary perspective, it doesn't make much sense to subject the mother of a species to this type of birthing process. So what was it that contributed to the human mind becoming as large as it was? Most traditional historians do attribute this to eating meat. They say once we started eating meat, this made our brain mass increase in size dramatically. And maybe that is what it was. I don't know. But at the same time, you look at it holistically and you say, well, this creature in totality that is the human being seems like some kind of alien hybrid as it relates to all of the other species that exist on the planet here. Some type of offspring from Nephilim mating with human Neanderthal women or something along those lines. However you want to view it, whatever you feel more comfortable with from a labeling perspective. You can look at it from a scientific evolutionary perspective, or you can look at it from a biblical perspective, or anywhere in between. Aboriginal tribes native to the lands that they inhabit have their own creation stories, their own traditions that explain how they got to be the way that they are. And intuitively, a lot of people understand that this is why really old people who get into their 80s and 90s start hunching over and shrinking in that way, because the physics of this body in this realm starts to break down and they start hunching over. The spine can't hold up to the weight of gravity here, and it starts to hunch over, and then the people are shorter and shorter and shorter as they get older and older and older. So not only do we sort of defy the physics of this place, but then on top of that, we have all these other little design flaws in our bodies where we're not producing our own vitamin C, which would help us to fight off viruses, pathogens, etc. We're not producing our own B12, which would allow us to survive on plants alone, like so many other creatures do. This would remove us from the food chain to the point where we wouldn't have to hunt and kill animals to survive. And it's worse than that, though, right? Because we do produce the same bacteria that the herbivores do. It's just in a part of the intestine that isn't absorbable. We just remove it before we ever can use it, which doesn't make any sense. It's like we were designed to participate in this food chain, to perpetuate whatever system some intelligence wanted to exist here. And then on top of all of that, we have this thymus gland that produces our T cells and B cells that is only active, for the most part, into puberty, and then eventually and gradually starts to decline in its activity to the point where it eventually no longer exists, doing what it did when you were younger, producing all of these powerful T cells that protect your body. And then on top of that, as well, we have the telomeres situation where eventually we don't produce enough of the enzyme that protects your chromosomes' ability to reproduce. And so eventually your cells cannot replenish themselves, and this is what causes old age and death. And I'm sure there's many, many more things that I'm just not aware of and didn't get into here that we could add to the list. And if you know of some of those things, please add them on. But that's enough for now. I'll leave it there. Later.